He returned from the war, but new battles awaited him at home. The black veteran, who survived the bullets of the enemy, faced what he could not defeat at the front, the hatred of his hometown. But if they thought he was going to bow his head, they didn't know who Silas Cole was. The train screeched against rusted rails as it dragged itself into the station, like a wounded beast, smoke curling into the cold gray sky of Mississippi, 1948, where the winter sun barely pierced the heavy clouds. Silas Cole stepped off, with a limp car deep into his stride, courtesy of a bullet meant to kill him in Normandy, but only succeeded in maiming. His army uniform hung loose on his once powerful frame, now worn thin by months in a military hospital and nights haunted by the echoes of gunfire and the screams of dying men. The war had ended, but Silas carried it with him, like a shadow stitched into his very skin. The familiar dirt roads of his hometown stretched before him, but nothing welcomed him. No neighbors waved, no old friends called his name, only the silence of a town that remembered him not as a hero, but as a black man who had the audacity to come back alive. Storefront windows stared blankly. The few white folks who passed him on the road looked through him, as if he were a ghost walking among the living. Even the colored folks, eyes cast downward, seemed wary, as if his uniform might invite trouble upon them. Trouble was never far. Silas found his father's old house weathered and frail, sitting in a patch of land swallowed by weeds. On the porch, a young boy sat whittling wood, a boy with eyes sharp as flint and soft as river mud. It was Elijah, his son, grown taller since Silas last saw him. Without a word, Elijah rose and embraced his father. No hesitation, no fear, just quiet strength. In Elijah's arms, Silas felt for a flicker of a second like a man again, not just a soldier discarded by both his country and his people. Yet even home was not safe. The next day, Silas tried to buy groceries at Morris General Store. The storekeeper, Morris himself, refused to serve him, spitting tobacco into the dirt as he called Silas a crippled boy who ought to know his place. Silas stood tall despite the tremor in his bad leg, but the whisper of a deputy's hand resting on his pistol at the edge of the counter forced him to leave empty-handed. That night, sitting on the porch with Elijah, Silas confessed the bitter taste of coming home to find the enemy wore different uniforms, but the same cruelty. Elijah listened, never interrupting, carving small birds out of wood with patient strokes. "They ain't gonna change," Silas muttered, staring into the fog-covered fields. "Then we make him," Elijah replied simply, with the conviction of youth untouched by compromise. Days turned to weeks, and Silas began to notice that Elijah wasn't just his son, he was his anchor, pulling him back to shore every time the currents of anger or despair threatened to drown him. Elijah taught him how to make crutches that fit right, how to navigate the town without drawing too much attention, and how to breathe again when the nightmares woke him screaming. They built things together, birdhouses, fences for the small patch of land, even a bench beneath a willow tree where Silas had once carved his wife's name before she died during the war. It wasn't just wood they shaped, it was dignity. Yet dignity in silence could not be enough. Silas watched as black veterans like himself were denied jobs, harassed, or worse. He saw Josiah, another returned soldier, beaten blind after demanding his paycheck. The weight grew unbearable, and one storm-heavy night, Silas limped into the courthouse demanding to speak to someone, anyone, about the rights he fought for overseas. They laughed. They pushed him down the courthouse steps like he was nothing more than a drunken beggar. His body broke further, but not his will. The following Sunday, Elijah wheeled his father, battered and bruised, into the church where the whole black community sat packed tightly. Silas stood slowly, shaking, leaning heavy on Elijah's shoulder, and spoke words that cracked like thunder. He spoke of Europe, of watching white soldiers die beside him, of pulling them from burning tanks, of bleeding in the mud for a country that looked away when he returned. He spoke of dignity, not just for himself but for every black man, woman, and child breathing under the heel of oppression. Silence swallowed the church, except for Elijah's steady breath beside him. Slowly, others stood, veterans and mothers and old men who remembered the taste of cotton field dust in their throats. From that day, something fragile yet stubborn took root. Silas, Elijah, and a handful of others began holding meetings beneath a willow tree. Crafting more than wood, they crafted a movement. Flyers printed in the dead of night. Letters written to faraway organizations. Quiet protests along the dirt roads that led to town. All while the white townsfolk watched with suspicion turning to hatred. It wasn't long before Sheriff Dalton came knocking, warning Silas that things could get worse if he didn't quiet down. But Silas had already seen the worst a man could endure, and he knew that no threat from Dalton could match the horror of battlefields abroad or the battle he now fought at home. Elijah was always there, pushing him forward, challenging him not to surrender. In secret, Elijah had taught himself how to read the law, scribbling notes by candlelight, helping his father draft speeches, prepare petitions, and understand the very rules meant to keep them chained. And yet, in the midst of resistance, Silas still found himself haunted. He dreamed of his wife, soft and sorrowful, sitting beneath the willow whispering for him to come home, but even in dreams, he could never quite reach her. He woke some nights drenched in sweat, clutching Elijah's small hand, as if the boy alone could drag him back from the brink. Their bond grew beyond father and son. They became partners in defiance, kindred souls carrying scars the world refused to see. Yet with every small victory, a storekeeper who begrudgingly served him, a petition delivered, a sympathetic reporter from up north, came the tightening noose of retaliation. Strange cars lingered near their home. Church windows were smashed. A burning cross appeared one night beneath the willow, setting the bench aflame. Silas stood before it, shoulders square, as Elijah quietly put a hand in his. The fire's reflection danced in their eyes, not just as a threat, but as a call. And still, Silas fought on, because he knew there was no retreat left for a man who had already given everything. The town became a crucible, forging not only the resolve of one man, but the quiet rebellion of a people who had learned, through Silas and Elijah, that survival was no longer enough. It was time to live free. But freedom comes slow and bitter, and the price was yet to be paid. The fire crackled hungrily, devouring the bench that had held so many whispered dreams, so many quiet plans beneath the sprawling limbs of the willow. The scent of burning wood and gasoline mixed thick in the night air, a warning meant to break their spirit, to send them crawling back into the shadows where men like Sheriff Dalton thought they belonged. But Silas stood unmoving, the orange glow reflected in his dark eyes, the steady press of Elijah's hand against his reminding him that fear was a choice he refused to make. He had faced death too many times to cower before men who carried torches like children playing at war. The wind shifted, sending embers swirling like fireflies into the black sky, and in that moment, Silas knew the fight had only just begun. The next morning, the town felt different, as if the air itself had thickened with an unspoken tension. Black folks moved carefully, their eyes darting between the white faces that stared at them too long, too hard. The grocer still refused to serve Silas, but now he did it with a sneer that curled like a knife, emboldened by the knowledge that the sheriff and his men would look the other way. At the post office, an old woman named Hattie Mae, who had always nodded politely in passing, averted her eyes and clutched her parcels tighter, as if just standing near Silas might bring trouble to her doorstep. It was the silence that cut the deepest, the way even those who once whispered words of support now held their tongues, afraid of what might come if they were seen standing beside him. But Silas knew silence was just another weapon, another way to keep a man small, and he refused to be erased. So he spoke louder. He stood outside the courthouse steps every morning, his crutches sinking slightly into the soft earth as he read aloud from the Constitution, his voice steady and sure even as white men spat at his feet. He wrote letters to newspapers that would never print them, scrawled petitions that would never be read, and still he fought. Every night, Elijah sat beside him, reading books borrowed in secret from the Reverend's library, filling their small house with words that had never been knit for men like them. Thurgood Marshall, Frederick Douglass. The laws and the loopholes, the promises and the betrayals buried in ink and paper. Elijah absorbed them all, his young mind sharpening into something fierce, something unbreakable. And then, the first real victory came, not with fireworks or fanfare, but in the simple defiance of a tired woman named Josephine Carter, who refused to step off the sidewalk when a white man approached. She did not lower her eyes. She did not move aside. And when the man shoved her, when his hand curled into a fist, Silas was there, his grip strong despite the pain in his bad leg, his voice steady, as he pulled her behind him, and met the man's rage with the unyielding steel of his own. "Not today," Silas said, his words carrying across the street, through the windows of the stores where white folks stood watching, through the walls of the courthouse where Sheriff Dalton sat with his boots on his desk. "Not ever again." The fight that followed was ugly, brutal, the kind that left scars deeper than flesh. Silas took the first hit but never fell. He swung with the weight of every injustice pressed into his bones, with the strength of a man who had lifted fallen brothers from the fields of France, who had carried his own suffering for too long. Blood splattered against the dirt road, and when the sheriff's men finally came, it was Silas they dragged away, his wrists bound too tight, his body aching, but his soul unbroken. From the jail cell, he could hear Elijah outside, his voice rising against the iron bars, calling out the names of every black soldier who had fought and died for a country that refused to see them. The words rang through the night, a battle cry wrapped in the voice of a boy who had learned too soon what it meant to fight. Days passed, then a week. The town whispered, waited, but Silas did not break. And then, the moment he had feared arrived like a storm rolling in on the horizon. In the dead of night, the jail door swung open, not with the clatter of keys, but the heavy silence of men who did not come with justice in mind. White sheets, rough hands, the stench of whiskey and sweat. They did not speak as they dragged him out, their grips bruising, their purpose clear. This was not an arrest. This was a sentence. The night swallowed them as they carried him beyond the edge of town, past the willow tree that still bore the scars of fire, into the belly of the woods where so many black men had met their end. The noose waited, hanging like a promise from the thickest branch. The leader, a man Silas recognized from the feed store, stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with the cruel satisfaction of a man who had never known fear. "You should have stayed quiet, boy," he said, and Silas almost laughed, because if they still thought of him as a boy, then they had never truly seen him. He did not beg. He did not plead. He stood as tall as his broken body allowed, staring into the faces of men who had never fought a real war, who had never known what it meant to lay in the mud and watch the light drain from a man's eyes. He thought of Elijah, of his wife's name carved into the willow, of every battle he had fought, both on foreign soil and here, on the land that claimed to be his home. And then, a gunshot split the night. A single, sharp crack that sent the men reeling, searching the shadows. Another shot. Then another. A voice steady, sure. "Let him go." Elijah stood at the edge of the clearing, his small hands gripping the rifle that had once belonged to Silas' father, the barrel steady despite the tremor in his breath. He was alone, but he did not waver. He did not run. The men hesitated, caught between their rage and the cold realization that a child had forced them to pause. In that moment, Silas saw it, the shifting tide, the unraveling of something old and rotted. The men were cowards, every last one of them, brave only in the safety of their numbers, in the certainty that no one would fight back. But Elijah was not afraid. He had never been afraid. And so they ran, one by one, melting into the darkness like ghosts retreating from the dawn. Silas collapsed to his knees, the noose falling slack as Elijah rushed to his side, his breath ragged, his hand shaking as he helped his father stand. They did not speak. There were no words for what had just passed between them, no language vast enough to hold the weight of what had nearly been lost. Together, They walked home beneath a sky that seemed brighter somehow, the stars burning fierce above them, as if the universe itself had been waiting for this moment. And though the fight was far from over, though the road ahead was still steeped in blood and struggle, Silas knew one thing for certain: he had not fought in vain. The war had never ended, but neither had the will to fight. And so they pressed on, two souls bound by defiance, stepping into the unknown with the quiet certainty that change was coming, whether the world was ready for it or not. The night hung thick and endless around them as they moved through the woods, their breath ragged, their limbs trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what had almost happened, from the knowledge that death had been so close it had whispered in Silas's ear, had tightened around his throat, had waited with open arms to claim him. But Elijah had sent it scattering into the dark, had stood with the rifle his grandfather once held, and in that moment he had been more than just a boy. He had been a reckoning, a force the world had never expected, a fire they had tried to snuff out but had only fueled. Silas felt the ground uneven beneath him, felt the pain in his leg grinding with every step, but he didn't stop, didn't slow, because Elijah was beside him, small but steady, his grip firm beneath his father's arm, his eyes locked straight ahead as if daring the night to challenge him again. The town sat quiet in the distance, the glow of lanterns flickering in windows, behind drawn curtains, behind doors bolted shut by people who had heard but not seen, who had known but not spoken, who had let it happen as they always had. But the wind had shifted now. They might not speak of it in the morning, but they would know. They would remember. And though fear might keep their mouths closed, there would be something different in the way they looked at Silas Cole now, not just as a man to be broken, but as a man who would not die easy, as a man whose son had turned the night against them, had faced them down with steady hands and an unshaken will. The house stood just as they had left it, the old wood groaning in the cold air, the willow tree at its side blackened by fire, but still standing, still reaching toward the sky like it refused to bow, like it refused to be anything less than what it was. They stepped onto the porch without a word, and when the door closed behind them, Silas let himself sink into the chair by the window, let his body finally feel the weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. But his mind did not rest. His hands still trembled, his chest still ached with the phantom press of the news that had nearly stolen his breath, and he knew sleep would not come for him tonight. Elijah sat across from him, the rifle resting against his knees, his face unreadable in the dim candlelight. He was too young for this, too young to have seen what he had seen, to have done what he had done, and yet there was no regret in his eyes, only something deeper, something older than the years he had lived, something that had always been there, but had now been carved into him in a way that could never be undone. "You saved me," Silas said, the words heavy, the truth of them sitting between them like something neither of them knew how to hold. Elijah nodded, slow and sure, his fingers running over the wood of the rifle as if committing it to memory. "They would have killed you," he said, his voice steady but quiet, as if saying it out loud made it more real, made it something that had truly happened and not just a nightmare they had stepped out of. Silas exhaled, ran a hand over his face, felt the sting of cuts he had not realized were there, the bruise already forming along his jaw where a fist had found him in the dark. "Yeah," he said. "They would have." The silence stretched between them, thick and unspoken, until Elijah finally lifted his gaze, his eyes burning with something fierce, something unshakable. "Then we don't let him try again." The word settled deep, echoing in Silas's chest, because he knew there was no turning back now, no pretending that things could return to what they had been. The town had drawn its line in the dirt, had made its choice, and now it was their turn to choose. The next morning, the bruises on Silas's body were purple and deep, blooming like flowers beneath his skin, but he did not stay in bed, did not rest. He limped into town with Elijah beside him, every step sending a sharp reminder through his leg, but he did not waver. Eyes followed them as they walked, some filled with quiet horror, some with something close to admiration, but most with the same old hatred, the same old contempt. Sheriff Dalton stood outside the courthouse, his arms crossed, his face unreadable as they approached. For a long moment, neither man spoke, only the wind filling the space between them, carrying the weight of all that had passed, of all that had not been said. "I should lock you up," Dalton said finally, his voice flat, but there was something else there too, something almost uncertain, as if he had not expected to see Silas standing before him, as if the rules had shifted beneath his feet, and he did not yet know how to regain his balance. Silas tilted his head slightly, feeling the stiffness in his neck, the dull ache in his ribs. "Then do it," he said, his voice low, steady. "Drag me back in. Let's see how many people hear me this time." Dalton's jaw tensed, his fingers curling against his belt, but he did not move, did not reach for the cuffs, did not call his deputies. He only stared for a long, heavy moment before spitting into the dirt at his feet. "You keep stirring trouble, Cole," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a warning that felt thinner now, less certain. "You and your boy both. It won't end well." Silas held his gaze, unflinching. "Not for who you think." He turned, stepping past the sheriff, feeling Elijah's presence at his side, solid and unshaken, and together they walked into the courthouse, into the place that had refused to acknowledge them, that had turned its back on every black man who had fought and bled and died for a country that still saw them as less than men. But they were here now, and they were not leaving. The battle was no longer just in the streets, no longer just in the shadows. It was here, in the words they would force into the light, in the rights they would demand, in the voices they would not silence. The door shut behind them with a finality that felt like the beginning of something vast, something unstoppable. And outside, the wind carried the whispers of change, curling around the courthouse steps, rustling through the streets, slipping beneath doors, and through cracks in the walls, a quiet storm gathering its strength, waiting for the moment it would break. The courthouse smelled of old wood and paper, the air thick with dust and history that had never belonged to men like Silas, history carved by hands that never intended to write his name among them. But he stepped inside anyway, his limp barely noticeable now, his mind sharper than the pain that twisted through his body. Elijah was at his side, his chin high, his eyes burning with the same silent defiance that had sent grown men running into the night, and Silas knew in that moment that no matter what happened, no matter how this ended, they had already done something the town would never forget. They had made themselves known, they had refused to be ignored, and now, no matter how many people wished them gone, they would not be erased. The clerk at the front desk stiffened as they approached, her thin lips pressing into a tight line as she glanced quickly toward the back office, where the judge sat behind his thick mahogany desk, a man who had never ruled in favor of a Negro before and never intended to start now. Silas placed his hands on the counter, feeling the worn wood beneath his fingers, grounding himself against the weight of all the eyes that had already turned toward them, the murmurs of white men in the corners, their conversations halting the moment he stepped forward. "I need to file a complaint," he said, his voice steady, though he knew it would do little good, knew the words would not be taken seriously, knew the paper would likely never even be stamped, but he spoke them anyway because every battle had to start somewhere, even the ones that seemed impossible to win. The clerk swallowed hard, her gaze flickering over his bruised face, the way one eye was still swollen, the way his lip had split in the night, and for a second, just a second, there was something in her face that looked almost like sympathy, but it was gone just as quickly, replaced by the cold, practiced indifference that allowed people like her to pretend none of this was their problem. "You'll need to speak to the sheriff," she said, her voice clipped, as if the words themselves were something sour in her mouth. Silas exhaled slowly, shaking his head, because they both knew what that meant. They both knew it was just another way of turning him away, another way of making sure the town's justice system remained a door locked from the inside. "I'm not here to speak to the sheriff," he said, and now his voice was harder, edged with something unmovable. "I want it in writing. I want it on record." The murmurs grew louder behind him, the shifting of bodies, the sound of boots against the wooden floor as men started to close in, their presence like the slow tightening of a noose that had not yet been pulled. But Silas did not move, did not step back, did not show even a flicker of the instinct to run that had been beaten into him since the moment he was old enough to understand what the world expected of a man like him. He felt Elijah beside him, still as stone, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and he knew his boy was ready to fight, ready to stand in the face of whatever came next. But this was not the moment for blood, not yet. This was the moment for something sharper, something that cut deeper than fists or bullets. The sound of a door creaking open echoed through the room, and then the judge himself emerged, his thick-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, his expression unreadable as he looked down at Silas with the kind of slow, measured gaze that white men used when they wanted to remind a Negro that they were smaller, that they did not belong in places like this. "Mr. Cole," the judge said, his voice carrying the practiced patience of a man who did not believe this was worth his time, who was already thinking of ways to dismiss him without making a scene. "I assume this has something to do with the unfortunate events of last night." Silas held his gaze, unflinching. "Unfortunate," he repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. "That's one way to put it. Attempted murder is another." The judge sighed, shaking his head, as if he had been dragged into something beneath him. "Now, Mr. Cole, let's not be dramatic. We don't have any evidence of that." Silas's jaw tightened, his fingers pressing harder into the wood of the counter, his heart pounding with the slow-burning rage of a man who had been told his whole life that what was done to him did not count, that his pain was not real if no white man was willing to acknowledge it. "You've got my word," he said, his voice low, steady, the kind of steady that made men nervous, that made them realize too late that something had already shifted, that something was coming they could not stop. "You've got my son's word. You've got the bruises on my body, the rope burns on my neck, the blood in the dirt where they dragged me. That enough for you?" The judge's mouth twitched, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension, sharp and unexpected. "It's enough for me." The room turned as one, eyes snapping to the far corner where a man stood, a white man, one Silas recognized but had never spoken to, a man named Thomas Whitaker, a farmer who kept to himself, who had never been known to interfere in the town's business, but there he was, standing with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "I saw him," he said, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. "Saw the torches. Heard the gunshots. Saw them drag him out. I didn't step in then, and I gotta live with that. But I'll step in now." The room shifted again, the tension rippling like a storm rolling over dry land, because this was not how things were supposed to go. This was not what men like the judge or the sheriff had planned, and now, for the first time, the weight of their control had cracked, just enough to let something slip through. The judge's face darkened, his jaw tightening, his hands gripping the front of his robe as if trying to find something solid to hold onto. "This is highly irregular," he said, but there was something in his voice now, something almost uncertain, because Thomas Whitaker was not just any man. He was a landowner, he was white, he was someone the town could not simply brush aside. And now, he had given his word in front of a room full of people, and even if they hated Silas, even if they wanted him dead, they could not ignore this, not without revealing just how deep their own rot ran. Silas felt Elijah's hand tighten on his sleeve, a silent question, a silent understanding passing between them. This was not over, not by a long shot. But something had shifted. The tide had turned. And for the first time in a long, long while, Silas Cole looked into the faces of the men who had tried to kill him and saw not certainty, not confidence, but fear. The days that followed were heavy with silence, the kind that stretched through the town like a coiled snake waiting to strike, the kind that settled in the spaces between whispers, in the glances thrown from behind curtains, in the way men lingered too long in doorways, watching, waiting, deciding. Silas knew what they were thinking, what they were plotting, because the town had never been one to forgive a black man for standing when he was supposed to kneel, never been one to let go of a grudge when it had been carved into the very foundation of its existence. He could feel it in the way Sheriff Dalton's deputies rode slower past his house now, in the way the general store's owner suddenly found reasons not to make eye contact, in the way the air had thickened with something more dangerous than hatred, uncertainty. Because the town had always been sure of its own power, sure that a man like Silas Cole could be silenced with rope, with fire, with the quiet acceptance of those who had never once stood against him. But Thomas Whitaker had changed that, had planted a seed that could not be unplanted, had turned what should have been another forgotten night into something else, something that festered and grew with every passing day, with every hushed conversation in the streets, with every shift in the wind that carried the scent of something old, something rotting. Silas could feel it as he stood on his porch at dusk, the rifle resting against the wooden railing, the weight of it familiar now, natural in a way it had never been before, because war had never truly left him, because the battlefields had only changed shape, because even here, even in the place he had once called home, the war was not over. Elijah sat beside him, quiet, thoughtful, his hands wrapped around the knife he had been sharpening for the past hour, the slow scrape of metal against stone the only sound between them, steady, relentless, like a heartbeat. The boy had not spoken much since that night, had not asked questions, had not sought comfort, because he had seen the world for what it was now, had looked it in the eye and understood that childhood was something that had been stolen from him long before he had even known he had it. Silas wanted to tell him things would get better, that there was still hope in the world, still light, still kindness, but the words felt like lies in his throat, felt like something a weaker man would say, a man who had not been left for dead in the dirt, a man who had not watched his son take a life to save his own. So he said nothing, only watched as the sun dipped below the trees, as the night stretched its fingers over the town, as the first hints of movement flickered at the edge of his vision, slow, deliberate, inevitable. They were coming. It was not a question of if, only when. And now, as the last light of day bled out across the horizon, he knew the answer. The first shot came from the trees, the crack of a rifle splitting the silence, splintering with just inches from his head, sending shards of the railing flying into the night. Silas moved without thought, without hesitation, rolling off the porch, dragging Elijah with him as the second shot rang out, slamming into the wall behind where they had just been sitting. The boy hit the ground hard but did not cry out, did not falter, already gripping the knife tighter, already scanning the shadows with the sharp, unwavering focus of a soldier who had never been trained but had been made. "Back door," Silas murmured, his voice low, steady, pressing the rifle into Elijah's hands because the boy was a better shot than he was now, because his own hands were shaking in a way they had not shaken in years, because the ghosts of war had risen from their graves and wrapped themselves around him, whispering things he had tried to forget. Elijah hesitated for only a moment, then nodded, slipping into the darkness without a sound, vanishing like a shadow swallowed by the night. Silas exhaled slowly, feeling the pain in his leg flare with every movement, feeling the old wound sing with something that was almost familiar, almost welcome, because pain meant he was still alive, meant there was still fight left in him. He pressed himself against the side of the house, eyes scanning the treeline, counting the figures that moved between the trees, low and slow, careful now, because they had expected him to be caught off guard, had expected him to be easy. But they had miscalculated. He raised his rifle, steadying his breath, lining up the shot, squeezing the trigger in a slow, deliberate motion. The explosion of gunpowder filled the night, and a shadow collapsed in the trees, a sharp cry breaking through the silence before being swallowed by the darkness. And then all hell broke loose. The night lit up with muzzle flashes, with the violent roar of bullets cutting through the air, with the sharp, cracking sound of wood shattering as the house was torn apart around him. Silas moved, fast and low, his body remembering things his mind had buried, rolling, ducking, returning fire in controlled bursts, counting each shot, listening for the screams, for the silence that followed. Somewhere in the distance, another shot rang out, and then another, and Silas knew Elijah was there, knew his son had found his place in the fight, knew that no matter how this ended, the boy would never be the same again. Time blurred, became something unrecognizable, became nothing but flashes of light and sound and pain, became nothing but the weight of the rifle in his hands and the smell of blood in the air, became nothing but the knowledge that this was not just about him anymore, that this was about something bigger, something older, something that had been waiting for its moment to rise. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, broken only by the ragged sound of his own breathing, by the distant, fading footsteps of the cowards who had run when the tide turned against them. Silas pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest, his vision swimming, and then he saw him, Elijah, standing at the edge of the porch, the rifle still clenched in his hands, his face streaked with sweat and dirt and something darker, something that glistened under the moonlight. His eyes met his father's, searching, asking, and Silas nodded, just once, just enough. They had survived. But the war was not over. It would never be over. Not here. Not in this town. Not in this world. And as the wind carried the scent of gunpowder and blood into the night, as the stars bore silent witness to what had been done, Silas Cole knew that the final battle was still waiting, just beyond the horizon, just beyond the reach of the dawn that had not yet come. The wind carried the scent of blood and gunpowder through the trees, whispering through the shattered remains of Silas's home, through the broken wood and bullet-ridden walls, through the empty spaces where breath had once been drawn and now would never be again. The town would know by morning. The bodies would be found. The whispers would spread like fire through dry grass, twisting through the streets, slipping through the cracks of doors and windows, wrapping themselves around the throats of men who had thought themselves untouchable. Silas stood in the wreckage, his rifle hanging limply in his hand, his breath coming in slow, deep pulls, his body heavy with exhaustion, with pain, with something deeper, something colder. He had known war, had lived it, had carried its weight on his shoulders long before he had ever been sent to foreign soil, and yet this was something else. This was home. This was what they had turned it into. Elijah stood beside him, silent, motionless, the rifle still clutched in his grip, his fingers locked around the worn wood as though it were the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. His face was unreadable, his eyes dark and distant, looking past the bodies, past the blood, past the town that had tried to erase them. He had taken lives tonight. Not just one, not just in a desperate moment of defense, but many. There was no going back from that. No undoing it. No washing it away. Silas could see it in the way the boy's chest rose and fell, in the way his shoulders remained tense, in the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly, as though he were still bracing for the next shot, the next shadow, the next attack. "We ain't safe here no more," Silas murmured, his voice low, rough, a quiet truth slipping through the smoke. Elijah's grip on the rifle did not loosen. He did not speak, did not need to. They had always known this was how it would end. The town had never intended to let them live, had never intended to let them be, and now, after this night, there would be no more pretense, no more whispered threats, no more waiting. The sun would rise, and the hounds would come. Sheriff Dalton would ride out with his men, not to bring justice, but to finish what had been started, to erase what had been done, to burn away the evidence of a war they had lost in the night. And the town would let them. The town would watch from behind its shutters, from behind its doors, would pretend it heard nothing, saw nothing, as it had done for generations. It would let them bleed out in the streets, let their names be forgotten, let the earth drink their blood as it had so many before them. Silas knew this. Elijah knew it too. There was no future here. No home. No freedom. Only a grave waiting to be dug. But he had not come this far just to die in the dirt of a town that had never wanted him. "Pack what you can," Silas said, his voice steady now, firmer, his decision made. "We leave before dawn." Elijah hesitated, his fingers tightening around the rifle, his gaze flickering toward the bodies that littered the yard, the men who had come in the dark to finish him, who had failed, who had left the world with nothing but silence and blood and the weight of their own choices. "They won't let us leave," he said finally, his voice quiet, but not uncertain. "They'll come for us. They'll come," Silas agreed. "But we won't be here when they do." They moved quickly, gathering what little they had, what little remained. The house was no longer a home, only a shell, only a place that had once held warmth, but now held nothing but the echoes of gunfire, the ghosts of men who had died with hate in their hearts and fear in their eyes. Silas took only what mattered: his rifle, the worn photographs of his wife, the few bills hidden beneath the floorboards. The rest was ash and ruin, destined to be swallowed by time. Elijah did not speak as he packed. As he moved through the house with quiet, deliberate steps, his body still wound tight with something unnamed, something that would never truly leave him. He had been a boy when the night began. He was not one now. The road stretched ahead of them in endless darkness, the sky yawning wide above, heavy with stars, with silence, with the weight of a past they would never escape. They rode in silence, their horses moving at a steady pace, their eyes on the horizon, on the place where the sky met the land, on the distant shape of a future they could not yet see. The town would wake soon. The sun would rise. And when it did, it would rise over a town forever changed, over streets that would never speak of what had happened, over houses that would pretend not to know why the Cole house stood empty, why the sheriff rode out with fire in his eyes and men at his back. It would rise over graves hastily dug, over blood-stained soil, over whispered warnings passed between those who had watched from the shadows, and knew now that the world was shifting beneath their feet. And it would rise over the road where two riders disappeared into the dawn, leaving behind nothing but the ghosts of a town that had tried and failed to kill them. Silas did not look back. There was nothing left to see. Only dust. Only echoes. Only the long, winding stretch of road that would carry them somewhere else, somewhere unknown, somewhere that may not be safer, but was at least not here. Elijah rode beside him, silent, his eyes forward, his hands steady, his breath slow and even. He had lost something in that house. But he had gained something too. And as they rode, as the first slivers of light touched the sky, as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the last traces of gunpowder and smoke into the past, Silas knew one thing for certain. The war was not over. Not for them. Not for the world. But they were still here. They were still breathing. And that, for now, was enough.